Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? That was the thought that would return to Everly Garcia again and again. The memory of their laughter, the way hardened soldiers had smirked at her clumsy apron and trembling hands. But that moment, the one where she snapped the rifle together in less than 12 seconds, was still in the future. For now, all anyone saw was a waitress who could barely remember an order. A foreign girl whose accent still carried the edges of another country, another life. The coffee cup slipped from her fingers as the echo of the explosion rolled through the valley. The sound wasn't supposed to be there. Not on a quiet morning in a Swiss mountain town, where the greatest excitement most days was a late tourist bus or the occasional drunk shepherd singing too loudly on his way home. Everly's small frame shook with the vibration as porcelain shattered. Across the wooden floor, eyes turned toward her, Klaus, the diner's owner, sighed heavily from behind the counter. The locals shook their heads in that way that confirmed what they already believed. Clumsy, distracted, not quite reliable. She bent to pick up the pieces, cheeks burning, and whispered an apology no one cared enough to hear. Her hands were steady again when she swept the fragments into a dustpan. Hands that could disassemble the gears of a broken watch by memory. Hands that had memorized diagrams of machines far more complex than coffee pots. Hands that, when no one was watching, could move with precision so clean it frightened even her. But in that diner, those hands only poured coffee. The morning sun spilled across the Alps in bright gold, painting the peaks in a way that seemed almost cruel, too beautiful for how small she felt. She tied her apron again, for the 4th time that week, and carried plates out to the regulars. To them, she was just Everly, the foreigner who sometimes mixed up strudel orders, the girl with dark hair always falling out of place, the one who worked too slowly, smiled too politely, apologized too often. Hans, the postal clerk, leaned back in his chair, voice carrying easily through the clatter of spoons in conversation. "She forgot my sugar yesterday," he announced with mock gravity. 3 times. Can you imagine? 3. He chuckled, proud of his performance. Werner, the bank manager, gave one of those small, knowing smiles. She tries. I'll give her that. But trying isn't the same as being sharp. His gaze slid toward her as she set down their plates in appraisal. Not of the food, but of her worth. She heard every word. She always did. And though she kept her expression still, her chest tightened. The truth was simpler than any of their insults. She'd been thinking about a problem with torque distribution. In a transmission she was sketching in her notebook later. Not sugar, not strudel. Something far more complicated. But that explanation would never satisfy them. In their eyes, a mistake was proof. Proof that she was slow. Proof that she was exactly what they said. She moved on, filling cups, smiling at tourists. Her mind already wandering to the tiny apartment above the bakery where her real life waited. Up there, she was not a waitress. Up there, she was an engineer, a mechanic, a quiet student of systems most people would never bother to understand. A desk covered in precision tools, scattered diagrams, notebooks filled with sketches of gears, circuits, firearms, a collection of parts she had ordered piece by piece, carefully, legally, from surplus dealers. Every evening, she sat at that desk, her fingers blackened by grease and graphite, her mind finally free. No one knew, and no one asked. The village had a way of fixing people in place. The librarian saw her as undereducated. The teenagers saw her as too slow. The old men saw her as decoration, something to look at between card games. Every misstep in the diner became part of the myth they built around her. Everly, the nice but dim girl from Spain. Maybe she hadn't finished school. Maybe she was running from something. Certainly not clever. Certainly not worth listening to. She had learned not to argue. Mentioning her degree in mechanical engineering only made people laugh harder. Mechanical engineering? Her? The memory of one man's bark of laughter had been enough to silence her forever on the subject, so she let them believe what they wanted. A waitress no more, but every night she prepared. The espresso machine Klaus had nearly given up on. She'd rebuilt its pressure regulator in 20 minutes. The freezer compressor no one could figure out. She'd diagnosed the fault before the technician even arrived. And in her room, alone, she worked on projects far stranger. Clockwork, restorations, automotive engines, electronic boards, stripped and rebuilt, and most of all, rifles, not for violence, not even for ownership, but for the beauty of their design. The M4 carbine above all, its balance of tolerances and stress loads, its gas system, its 7 major parts that could come apart and fit together again with us. The elegance of a puzzle perfectly solved. She practiced with her eyes closed. 10 seconds, 11, 12, then faster, until her fingers no longer thought. They knew. No one in the diner imagined it. How could they? They saw spilled coffee, not steel precision. They saw an accent, not intelligence, and yet Everly knew something else. The way the men in tactical gear had studied the diner a week earlier. Their eyes on the exits, their voices low words. Like extraction point and contingency. Not tourists, soldiers. She had carried their coffee, answered their polite questions, told them which road had been washed out in the spring floods. She had recognized their gear, their encrypted radios, their maps. She had known, long before anyone else in the village, that something serious was happening in the mountains above. She had not told them everything she knew. Not yet, because she had learned something in her years here, something colder than the wind that swept the peaks. People didn't want the truth from her. They wanted their version of her, the clumsy waitress. The slow girl, the foreigner who was lucky to have a job at all. So she smiled, poured coffee, and tucked the truth away where no one could see it. But that morning, as she wiped down the tables after Hans's cruel little speech, she felt something stir inside her, a question she couldn't silence. How long could she let them believe she was nothing? A reflection stared back at her in the diner's window. Small, forgettable, apron stained from breakfast rush. Behind that glass, the mountains stood in silence, peaks jagged against the sky. She had climbed them often, alone, following routes. Others said were too dangerous. She had mapped them, studied their lines. Just as she had studied the diagrams of machines, she knew their secrets. The way she knew the secret of the M4 in her drawer upstairs. Invisible in the diner, unstoppable, if she was ever given the chance. But no one was going to give her the chance. She knew that, if her life was going to change, it would have to be taken seized in the moment when everyone else still thought. She was clumsy, stupid, small. The chance was coming. She could feel it, though she couldn't name it yet. And when it did, she would not drop it the way she had dropped that coffee cup. Because sometimes the smallest hands carry the greatest precision. Sometimes the most dismissed person in the room is the only one who's ready when everything else falls apart. She cleared another table, smiled another smile, listened as the retired men behind her laughed, and said she probably couldn't change a light bulb without help. But she didn't argue. She only thought, wait. Why did she work through the night when everyone else in the village was asleep? That was the question the neighbors asked, though never to her face. They only whispered. When they thought she couldn't hear, upstairs, above the bakery, the answer came in the steady hum of gears, the quiet click of tools, the sharp scent of oil. Everly sat bent over her desk, sleeves rolled to her elbows, dark hair pinned back, her hands steady in the pool of lamplight. A tiny Swiss watch ticked faintly in front of her, its movement half assembled, its gears scattered across a square of velvet cloth. Her fingertips moved with care, aligning pieces smaller than seeds, fitting them with patience most people would. Mistake for weakness, patience had been her shield. Patience had carried her through nights when the whole town treated her like furniture. Patience had taught her that people don't need to believe in you for you to become something they'd never understand. The watch clicked once, then began to tick with perfect rhythm. She smiled faintly, not at the watch, but at the proof of what her hands could do. At the reminder that, in a world that constantly told her she was less, she was quietly becoming more. On another corner of her desk lay something far less delicate, a disassembled rifle bolt gleaming under the lamp. She turned from the watch and picked up the part, running her fingers along the grooves, tracing the design like an artist studying a painting. The M4 carbine, 7 pieces, modular, balanced between chaos and control. She had memorized its blueprints, its tolerances, its failure points. Not because she wanted to fire it, but because she loved the logic inside its steel. It was a machine that had to work under the worst conditions imaginable. Snow, mud, blood. Machines that fail get people killed. Machines that work save lives. That clarity, that honesty of purpose, spoke to her. She closed her eyes. Her hands moved, piece by piece. She assembled it on instinct. The click of metal locking into place was its own kind of music. 12 seconds later, the mechanism was whole again, perfect, functional. She opened her eyes, steady breath leaving her chest. A part of her always thrilled at that moment. The beauty of something broken becoming whole again, faster, smoother, cleaner than anyone would expect from someone like her. But downstairs, in the daylight, no one wanted to see that side of her. To them, she was still just Everly. The gossip had begun with a simple observation from Frau Weber, who lived across the street and never missed a detail. "She gets packages every week," Weber whispered over coffee. "Boxes from companies I don't recognize. And at night, mechanical noises. Not normal household sounds." The words traveled quickly, like cracks through ice, by the time they reached the diner. They had hardened into suspicion. Hans, always eager to be the loudest voice, leaned across his table to Werner. "Strange, don't you think? All this military activity up in the mountains. And are Everly suddenly ordering strange equipment?" His voice carried, as it always did. He wanted her to hear. Werner frowned with the satisfaction of a man discovering an idea that confirmed his prejudice. Not the kind of purchases you expect from a waitress. Specialized tools, technical manuals, and she's been out hiking alone near the exercise site. I've seen her. It makes you think. The customers at surrounding tables pretended not to listen, but their silence was heavy. Everly carried plates past them, her face composed, her hands steady, though inside she felt them not tightening. She had expected indifference. She had even accepted dismissal. But suspicion was something new. Suspicion had weight. Suspicion could crush. By evening, when she returned upstairs, she felt their eyes still on her, watching, measuring, waiting for her to make the wrong move so their whispers could grow louder. She shut the door, leaned against it, and closed her eyes. She thought about the irony. The same skills that made her dangerous in their minds were the ones she had built out of survival. Her projects had been her way of staying alive, of keeping her mind from withering away in a world that only wanted her to carry coffee and apologize. Now, those same projects had become proof of something sinister. She looked at the rifle parts on her desk. She thought about the soldiers in tactical gear, the way they had studied their maps. She thought about the helicopter she had heard the day before, thudding through the valley toward the old avalanche station. Training, they said. Exercises. But the words she'd overheard contingency, extraction, defensive positions told her this was no game. And she thought, they're going to need help. They just don't know it yet. But who would believe her? Who would trust the waitress who forgot strudel orders? The next morning, she carried coffee to the Mullers, who smiled with exaggerated patience. "Write it down this time." "Everly," Mrs. Mueller said sweetly, as if speaking to a child. "I know it's hard to remember everything." Everly wrote it down, though she had served them the same meal every Tuesday for 18 months. Chicken salad, dressing on the side. Reuben, no pickles, hot chocolate with extra cream, apple juice, no ice. The ritual wasn't about memory. It was about control, about showing her where she belonged. She wrote it down anyway, because arguing was useless, and yet, beneath her silence, something restless stirred. She thought of the explosion that had shaken the diner windows days before. Not a training blast, not controlled. She had recognized the difference instantly, though no one asked her opinion. She thought of the smoke she had seen through binoculars. Black against the snow, rising from the abandoned monitoring station. She thought of the military vehicles crawling through the village, heading for roads she knew would never reach their target in time. Her knowledge was invisible, her competence irrelevant, and still she couldn't shake the thought that one day, very soon, it wouldn't be. That evening, Klaus called her into the back office. His face was tight, his hands restless. "Everly," he said, "I have to ask you something." He looked at her the way someone looks at a stranger who suddenly became dangerous. "Are you involved in anything? Anything suspicious? Anything that might bring trouble here?" Her stomach turned cold. The question hurt more than the gossip, because Klaus had been the one person who sometimes looked at her with something like belief. She met his eyes. "No, I fix things, that's all. I buy tools. I study systems. That's how I spend my nights." But she could see in his face that her words weren't enough. Gossip had done its work. Suspicion had seeped too deep. She left his office with the quiet knowledge that she had lost something. Trust, belonging, the fragile little corner of safety she had carved out here. Upstairs, that night, she disassembled the M4 again. Her hands were steady, but her chest ached. She thought of the soldiers, of the rumble of helicopters. She thought of neighbors who saw boxes at her door and imagined conspiracies. She thought of the difference between what people wanted to believe and what was true. The rifle clicked together in 11 seconds. Her best time yet, but no one would ever see it. Unless something broke that only she could fix. Unless someone finally needed the skills they had spent years dismissing. Unless the moment came where pretending to be less wasn't possible anymore. The sound of the rifle bolt snapping into place echoed through her apartment like a promise. She whispered to herself, barely audible, as if afraid the walls would hear. "They don't know me, not yet." And outside, in the mountains, the wind carried the first signs of the storm. What happens when the people who've ignored you suddenly treat you like a threat? That was the question staring back at Everly across the diner's corner booth. A uniformed officer sat opposite her, notebook open, eyes sharp. Captain Thomas. Richter, Swiss military police. He wasn't cruel, not yet, but his presence had weight. The kind of weight that turned whispers into chains. Her apron was still tied around her waist. Her hands folded on the table to keep them from trembling. Outside, customers pretended to eat while stealing glances. Each glance carrying the same unspoken verdict. The investigation was proof enough. "I understand you've been making unusual purchases," the captain said evenly. "Specialized tools, equipment, technical manuals." His tone carried no accusation, only formality. But in the silence that followed, the words sank like stones. Everly kept her voice steady. "I study mechanical systems. Engines, clockworks, sometimes firearms. From an engineering perspective, firearms," he repeated, his gaze narrowing. Her throat tightened. She wanted to explain about tolerances, gas systems, the beauty of precision under stress. But she knew how it would sound. A waitress talking about chamber pressure and rotating bolts. It would only deepen the suspicion. "It's academic," she said softly. "Design fascinates me." The captain scribbled a note, face unreadable. "We'll need to examine your apartment. Until then, your movements are restricted. Work and home, nothing else." Her heart sank. It wasn't an arrest. Not officially. But it might as well have been invisible yesterday. She was now the center of their scrutiny. the foreign woman under suspicion, the one who might be hiding something. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Customers whispered. Klaus avoided her eyes. By evening, she understood that no matter what the investigation found, her life here was over. The invisible waitress had become the suspicious outsider. Even if cleared, she would never be trusted again. But that night, when the mountain shook, none of it mattered. The explosion came at 2:47 in the afternoon, a low, rolling boom that rattled the diner's windows, followed by a column of smoke rising black against the snow. Customers crowded to the glass, murmuring in alarm. Klaus's radio crackled with urgent chatter. Multiple casualties, equipment failure, immediate evacuation required. Everly's chest tightened as she listened. This wasn't training. This wasn't controlled. Something had gone wrong, catastrophically wrong, at the monitoring station. She pressed her hand against the window pane, staring at the distant plume. She knew the terrain. She knew the roads wouldn't reach. The ambulance siren wailed down the street, but she could already see the futility. By the time ground rescue arrived, hours would have passed. Hours the injured didn't have. What happened? She asked, but Klaus's pale face told her enough. The extraction helicopter had been damaged. Weather was moving in. The medic on site was down. The communication specialist, too. They were cut off, with casualties that needed evacuation now. Not in 4, not in 6, not tomorrow morning, now. Everly's mind spun through calculations. Altitude, weather, survival probabilities. She pictured the map in her apartment. The eastern face route she had traced a dozen times. It was faster, though brutal. She had the gear. She had the skills. She had the knowledge to reach them. But she also had an order, confined to the village, under suspicion. If she acted, she'd face consequences, serious ones. Her gaze drifted to the smoke again. How many lives would be lost if she stayed silent? By 4 o'clock, desperation had spread through the emergency channels. 3 seriously injured, 1 critical, internal bleeding, possible head trauma, a compound fracture. The damaged helicopter couldn't fly them out safely. The weather. Window was closing. Captain Richter arrived at the diner, his face lined with stress. His formal tone was gone. "Do you know any routes to the station our teams might not?" he asked. She pulled her phone from her apron, traced the eastern route with her finger. "This cuts hours, but it's technical, climbing, dangerous." The captain shook his head. "Our people aren't trained for that. Mountain rescue is tied up elsewhere. We're on our own." He wanted an answer, but not from her. Not really. She could see it in his eyes. Even now, even desperate, he couldn't imagine a waitress doing what his soldiers could not. And yet the words came out before she could stop. "Them. I can reach them." The room went still. Klaus turned toward her, horrified. The captain stared, disbelieving. "You?" His voice was tight. "This isn't a hiking trip. It's hostile terrain, life and death." "I know exactly what it is," she replied, her voice low, steady. "I know the route. I have the skills. And if I don't go, people are going to die." Klaus's voice cracked. "Everly, this is madness. You'll kill yourself." She looked at him with something like sorrow. "I've been killing myself for 2 years. Pretending I'm less than I am. At least this matters." The captain's jaw clenched. "Unauthorized action will be treated as obstruction of military operations. If you fail, you'll die. If you succeed, you'll face charges." She stood. "If I do nothing, they'll die. That's the only outcome I can't live with." The words felt final as they left her lips. She turned toward the door. Klaus called after her, his voice breaking. "Everly, wait." She paused, just long enough to meet his eyes. "You said once I couldn't fix the register, couldn't fix the freezer, couldn't fix anything that mattered. But you were wrong. I can fix this." Then she was gone, the door slamming shut. Behind her, in her apartment, she pulled open drawers, packing with mechanical precision. Climbing gear, Medical kit, repair tools, maps, radios. Every piece of knowledge she had gathered for years was suddenly needed all at once. Her fingers moved without hesitation. Harness buckles clicked, ropes coiled, supplies stacked down in the street. The villagers stared up at her window, whispering, "Suspicious yesterday, dangerous today." None of them understood what she was doing, and perhaps they never would, but she understood. This was the test she had been training for in silence. The moment her preparation met purpose, the moment invisible became undeniable. As she shouldered her pack, she whispered to herself the words she had carried like armor for years. "They don't know me. Not yet." The sun was already tilting toward the peaks when she stepped into the street. The eastern face waited, brutal and unforgiving. The smoke still rose in the distance. Every step toward the mountain was a step away from the life she had been trapped in. The life of the stupid waitress ended at the village edge. The climb would decide who she really was. How far can determination take a body that no one believes in? That was the question burning in Everly's chest as she left the village behind. The sun was already lowering, a sheet of amber light across the valley. Every step she took into the narrowing trail felt like a point of no return. Behind her, whispers swirled like smoke. Waitress. Foreigner, suspicious, mad. Ahead, only the brutal stone face of the Schneeberg Mountain, rising like a wall she had chosen to climb. Her pack weighed heavy on her shoulders, but the weight steadied her. Every piece inside it was deliberate. Ropes, coiled with precision. Carabiners polished smooth from practice. Medical kit wrapped in oilcloth. Tools arranged for speed. No wasted space. No wasted time. Years of preparation distilled into 30 pounds of silent proof. The path grew steep, narrowing to scree and jagged switchbacks. Her boots dug in. Her breathing slowed into rhythm. She had hiked this terrain before, in secret, when no one noticed her absence. Alone, she had memorized each ridge, each fracture in the cliff, each ledge that could hold a climber's weight. She had not known why she prepared then. She only knew that one day it would matter. Now she did. The radio clipped to her harness crackled with desperation. Military channels, voices sharp with tension. Condition deteriorating. Internal bleeding worsening. Helicopter not stable. Negative on ground approach. Repeat negative. She paused, leaning against stone, listening. 3 injured, 1 critical. No evacuation before morning. The kind of words that meant death. By waiting, she pushed on. The mountain face loomed above her now. Its eastern cliff a jagged throat of granite. The normal trail veered away. Gentler but miles longer. The route she had chosen led straight up. Technical climbing, dangerous. Yes. But 3 hours faster, and 3 hours was life. She uncoiled her rope, looped her harness, checked each knot with mechanical precision. Fingers brushed chalk across stone, testing holds, weighting each one before trusting it. Then she pulled herself upward into the silence of the mountain at first. The climb was steady. Her body remembered the rhythm. Reach, pull, place, breathe. Each motion careful, exact, like the assembly of a machine. But the higher she rose, the more the wind found her. Cold fingers tugging at her pack, shoving against her balance. Pebbles clattered away into nothingness below. She forced her focus tighter, narrowing the world to stone and breath and the next secure hold. By the second pitch, sweat soaked her back. Muscles burned. The rope cut lines across her gloves. A slip here would mean a fall no body could survive, but fear did not take her. She thought of something Klaus once said when the espresso machine broke. "Leave it. We'll call a professional." As if her hands had been ornamental, not capable. She remembered the laughter when Hans claimed she couldn't change a light bulb. She remembered the pity in Greta's eyes. Not sharp enough, not trustworthy, not one of us. Every insult, every dismissal became fuel. She placed a cam into the crack, clipped in, and climbed higher. The third pitch bit harder. Loose rock, shifting beneath her boots, edges crumbling as she pressed her weight. One mistake, one fragment breaking wrong, and she'd vanish into the valley below. She paused, chest against the stone, heartbeat loud in her ears, her breath clouded white in the falling dusk. "Why are you here?" she whispered to herself, not as doubt but as reminder. And the answer came clear. Because lives depended on it. Because for once, her skills mattered. Because if she stayed in that diner one more year, pretending she was nothing, she would vanish. Anyway, piece by piece, into silence, the wind roared like a crowd trying to push her down. She climbed anyway. Hours stretched, shadows deepened, her fingers grew raw, nails cracked under pressure. Once, her boot slipped, and her stomach lurched into emptiness before the rope caught. She pressed her forehead to the cold rock, trembling, then laughed softly through her teeth. Not today. At last, she reached the ledge system carved decades ago when the monitoring station had been built. Narrow stone paths, wide enough for one careful step at a time, wrapped around the cliff. Beyond them, the faint shape of concrete walls. Half hidden in smoke, she was close now. Close enough to hear the thrum of rotor blades as the damaged helicopter idled uselessly. Close enough to catch the faint shouts of soldiers echoing in the wind. She paused on the ledge, muscles shaking, chest heaving. The village would never believe she had done this. They wouldn't believe she had even tried. But belief didn't matter. The mountain had no opinion. The injured man had no luxury of doubt. She pressed forward. The monitoring station loomed at last. Brutal concrete built into the rock, its windows shattered from the blast, its walls scarred with black smoke. Soldiers moved like shadows in the dim light, weapons slung, faces hard. With urgency, she saw stretchers laid out in the lee of the wall, bodies unmoving. She saw the glint of rifles swinging toward her as she stepped into the open. "Identify yourself." A voice barked. 3 rifles locked onto her. The air thickened with the potential for violence. She raised her hands slowly, palms outward. Her voice carried steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Don't shoot. My name is Everly Garcia. From the village, I'm here to help." For a moment, silence. The soldiers stared, confused. As if she were a ghost, one of them stepped forward, a sergeant with hollow eyes. Exhaustion stamped deep in his face. He blinked in disbelief. "You're the waitress," he said flatly. "Yes," she answered. "And the only reason I'm standing here is because I know the route you couldn't take. I have medical supplies. I can help with evacuation." His jaw worked as he stared at her, caught between protocol and desperation. He shook his head, muttered, "This is a military operation. Civilians can't." A shout cut through the argument. "Sergeant! Lieutenant's crashing! We need help now." The sergeant's eyes closed for a beat. When they opened, they held something raw decision. He jerked his chin toward the wounded. "You have 10 minutes. Do anything stupid, and I'll end it myself." Everly lowered her hands, heart pounding, and moved past him toward the stretchers. She saw them then, the broken bodies. A young man pale and shaking, leg twisted at an impossible angle, another unconscious, skull bandaged with bloody cloth, and the last lips blue, chest heaving. Shallow, blood pooling beneath him. Her throat tightened, but her hands were steady. For 2 years they had carried plates. For 2 years they had fumbled strudel orders. For 2 years they had been dismissed as clumsy, unremarkable, useless. Now at last, they were exactly what they were meant to be. She dropped her pack beside the wounded and spoke with a clarity she didn't know she possessed. "Show me the helicopter. I'll need power tools, and someone get me more light." The sergeant blinked, startled. What the hell are you?" Her eyes met his, unwavering. "I can fix it, but we don't have time." And for the first time in years, someone listened. What do you do when the only thing between life and death is your own untested courage? That was the question pressing against Everly's chest as she knelt beside the bloodied stretchers. The mountain wind tore at her hair, carrying the smell of smoke and oil around her. Soldiers moved with grim urgency, faces smeared with exhaustion and disbelief. Their rifles were still within reach, eyes still watching her every move. She could feel the doubt like heat on her skin. What could she possibly do? She's just a waitress. The man with the broken leg groaned faintly. Pain etched across his face. The unconscious officer's breath rasped in shallow bursts. But the third Thompson, someone muttered, was slipping faster. His skin was ashen, lips tinged blue, his pulse barely fluttering beneath her fingers. Internal bleeding, she thought. Minutes, not hours. She looked up at the sergeant who had allowed her this chance. His expression was tight, caught between fear of trusting her and fear of losing his men. "Your medic's down?" she asked. He nodded once. "Then you don't have a choice," she said quietly. Her pack hit the ground with a thud. She pulled it open, movements quick but precise, laying out what she had: pressure bandages, field dressings, an emergency kit she'd built from surplus. She had practiced these procedures at night, memorized protocols from manuals, tested her steadiness on her own skin. Never on a bleeding man at the edge of death. Her hands didn't shake. She applied pressure, adjusted positioning, improvised supports with calm determination. Her voice softened as she spoke to the injured, even those unconscious. Not for them, they couldn't hear, but for herself. To remind herself that these weren't diagrams. These were lives. When Thompson's pulse steadied for a moment, faint but measurable, relief swelled through her chest, but she knew it wouldn't last. He needed evacuation, immediate, and the only way out was broken. Her eyes turned toward the helicopter. It sat like a wounded bird on the pad, rotors still intact but tail sections scarred from shrapnel. Smoke drifted from one corner of its fuselage. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Chun, stood near it, helmet under her arm, jaw set in frustration. Everly rose, wiping blood onto her apron, and approached. "What's wrong with it?" Chun's eyes narrowed. "Everything. Electrical systems fried, hydraulic feedback inconsistent. It's not safe to carry passengers." "Let me look." The pilot gave a harsh laugh. "You? This is military tech. You don't just—" The sergeant cut in sharply. "We don't have time. Let her try." Chun's disbelief burned in her eyes, but the weight of her comrade's groans pressed heavier. She hesitated, then gave a small, reluctant nod. 10 minutes, she said. "Then I take it back and we try ground evac." Everly climbed into the cockpit, heart hammering. The control panel flickered with erratic lights, warning systems screaming silently in red. She ran her fingers over the instrumentation, tracing wires, testing switches. Her mind shifted into the clarity she knew so well, the state where fear vanished, replaced by systems, diagrams, logic, electrical first, always electrical first. She pulled panels aside, revealing scorched wiring, melted insulation. She followed circuits with her fingertips, visualizing current paths, identifying where flow collapsed. She reached for her tools. The pilot hovered, incredulous. "Do you even know what you're looking at?" Everly didn't answer. She soldered a bypass connection with steady hands, patched a line with improvised insulation. The helicopter groaned, panel lights flickering. One more connection. One more adjustment. She closed her eyes, recalling diagrams she'd memorized in nights when the village slept. Click. The primary systems hummed to life. Warning lights shifted. Still not perfect, but functional. She exhaled slowly. Electrical stable, hydraulics. Chun leaned in, checking gauges. Her disbelief softened into awe. It's actually working." Everly crawled beneath the console, tracing hydraulic lines. One valve fractured. Pressure inconsistent. She improvised a seal, tightening clamps with the care of a watchmaker. The hiss slowed, then ceased. She backed out, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Check again. The pilot flipped through diagnostics, her voice lower now. Main rotor stable. Tail. Efficiency reduced, but controllable. Passenger capacity? Possible. She looked up, stunned. How the hell did you do that? Everly allowed herself the faintest smile. I've been preparing for this my whole life. You just didn't notice. Behind them, the sergeant shouted. Thompson was slipping. Again, the urgency snapped them back. Chung climbed into the cockpit. Running her pre-flight checks, the rotors began to spin, thunder rolling against the mountain walls. Soldiers scrambled to prepare the stretchers for evacuation. Everly returned to Thompson's side. His pulse fluttered weakly under her fingers. She leaned close, whispering, Hold on. We fixed the machine. Now we'll get you out. The stretcher was lifted, secured into the cabin. The others followed, grimacing through pain. Everly helped stabilize 4 lines. Strapped down limbs, adjusted supports. Her hands moved as if she'd done this 100 times. In truth, it was the first time. But every late night, every hour of silent practice had been building to this moment. As the helicopter roared, kicking dust and smoke into the air, Chung called out over the noise. We can carry 3. The rest stay behind. The sergeant met Everly's eyes. Gratitude, confusion, disbelief, all tangled together. He shouted, You saved them. I don't know who you are, but you saved them. The helicopter lifted, blades thundering, rising against the fading sky. The wounded were leaving the mountain alive. Everly stepped back, chest heaving, hair whipping in the downdraft. For the first time in years, she felt her skills matched to something that mattered. No strudel orders, no spilled coffee, no laughter behind her back. Just life and death. And her hands proving the difference. The helicopter vanished into the horizon. Silence returned, heavy and reverent. The sergeant approached her slowly, rifle still slung but forgotten. His voice was rough when he spoke. You're not what they said you were. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. I never was. The wind carried the smoke away. For a moment, the mountains seemed to breathe again. What happens after you prove them all wrong? Everly stood on a mountain ledge, her body aching, her ears still ringing from the thunder of rotor blades. The helicopter had vanished into the storm's edge, carrying the injured into safety for the first time since she left the village. Silence wrapped around her, but it wasn't the silence of invisibility she had always known. This was heavier, denser, filled with the stunned breath of soldiers who didn't know what to make of her. She dropped to sit on the cold rock, pulling her knees to her chest. Her gloves were torn, fingertips raw, apron stained with blood. For a moment, exhaustion crashed into her all at once. The climb, the repairs, the endless tension of being seconds from failure. It all poured through her bones until she shook with it. The sergeant approached. He crouched beside her, his rifle slung across his chest, his face streaked with grime. You should be dead, he said flatly. She turned her head toward him, too tired to argue. You climbed a face trained men wouldn't attempt. You stabilized a man with no medical training. You repaired a helicopter you weren't even supposed to touch. And somehow, his voice cracked, softer now. Somehow 3 of my people are alive because of you. Everly didn't answer. She stared at her scraped hands, the same hands they had laughed at for spilling sugar. The sergeant shook his head, almost angrily, as if struggling to fit her into a world that had no space for her. Who are you? She smiled faintly. Just a waitress. The words hung in the smoke-filled air, and for the first time, someone didn't laugh. By the time they descended the mountain the next morning, escorted by replacement teams, news had already traveled. Faster than the wind, the village that had once dismissed her as clumsy now gathered in tight knots outside Klaus's diner. Whispering in disbelief, soldiers spoke first, in hushed voices. She climbed the east face alone. She fixed the helicopter. She kept them alive until extraction. Klaus stood at the diner window when she walked back into town, his face pale, eyes red from a night without sleep. He stepped outside, his apron still dusted with flour, and looked at her as though he had never really seen her before. "Everly," he whispered. No lecture, no reprimand, just her name, fragile as glass. She wanted to smile, to reassure him she was fine. But she wasn't fine. She was raw, and as villagers pressed closer, their gazes shifting from suspicion to awe, she felt no victory in it, just the quiet sting of irony. For 2 years, they had looked straight through her. Now, suddenly, she was visible, but only because she had risked her life. Captain Richter arrived before noon, his uniform crisp again, his composure restored. But his eyes held something different. No longer the cold suspicion of a man investigating a threat, but the careful respect of someone recalculating everything they thought they knew. He met her outside the diner. Soldiers and villagers stood in silence around them, the air electric with curiosity. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said. His voice carried enough for the crowd to hear. "You interfered in a military operation, entered a restricted zone, and handled classified equipment without authorization." Everly stood straight, her chin lifted. She didn't flinch. "You also saved 3 lives when every official path had failed." His voice softened, almost imperceptibly. "That is fact." The villagers shifted uneasily. Some looked at her with pride, others with guilt. Hans, the postal clerk, kept his eyes on the ground. Greta, the librarian, fidgeted with her scarf. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" the captain asked. Everly's throat tightened. Words crowded her mind, but none seemed enough. Finally, she said simply, "I couldn't stand by while they died. That's all." The silence after her words was thick, almost reverent. Richter nodded slowly. "We'll file a report, and there will be consequences, but—" He paused, searching her face. "Sometimes rules serve survival, and sometimes survival serves rules. This time, you chose correctly." He turned to his men. "Stand down." The soldiers dispersed, but the villagers remained, staring at her as if seeing a stranger. Everly slipped past them into the diner, her body trembling with exhaustion she could no longer hide. Inside, Klaus pressed a cup of coffee into her hands. His eyes were wet. "You shouldn't have had to prove yourself this way," he said quietly. She stared into the dark surface of the coffee, her reflection fractured by ripples. For years, she had swallowed the casual cruelty, the endless dismissal. For years, she had kept her brilliance hidden, believing patience was enough. But patience hadn't changed anything. Only action had, and the cost of that action was clear. Whatever life she had before was gone. She wasn't the invisible waitress anymore. But she wasn't free either. She was something else now, something caught between suspicion and admiration, between punishment and recognition. That night, alone in her apartment, she sat at her desk surrounded by the tools and diagrams that had been her secret sanctuary. But the room felt different. The quiet no longer comforted her. The machine parts no longer belonged only to her. The world had seen her now, and once seen, she couldn't be unseen. She picked up the rifle bolt from her workbench, turning it. In her hands, the same precision, the same steel, the same beauty. But it wasn't just hers anymore. In the stillness, she whispered to herself, "You can never go back." Outside, the village slept. But somewhere in the mountains, men lived who would have been dead, and Everly knew that was enough, for now. How do you return to ordinary life after proving yourself in the extraordinary? That was the question Everly carried with her in the months that followed. The mountain thawed into spring, snow retreating from its ridges, rivers swelling with meltwater. Tourists returned to the village, bright voices filling the cobbled streets. The diner bustled again, the scent of pastries drifting from Klaus's oven, the clatter of coffee cups echoing through mornings. To a passerby, it was as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. Everly still wore the apron. She still carried plates, poured coffee, scribbled orders. But when she moved through the diner now, silence followed. Not the silence of dismissal, not anymore, but the silence of wait. People watched her, measured her, treated her words with a caution that felt heavier than laughter ever had. Hans no longer joked about sugar. Greta no longer smiled with pity. Instead, they lowered their voices when she passed, as though afraid of offending someone who had been to places they could not imagine. The village's suspicion had become reverence, but reverence was only another kind of distance. She was no longer invisible, but neither was she one of them. Some evenings, when the rush ended and Klaus wiped down the counter, he would glance at her with something like guilt. "I should have believed you," he said once. Everly had only nodded. There was nothing else to say. Belief came too late for it to matter. The military returned twice in those months, not with rifles raised, but with papers, interviews, polite questions that were never entirely free of suspicion. Captain Richter sat at the same booth again, his voice formal but softer. "Your actions saved lives," he said. "That cannot be denied. But the question remains, why were you ready when no one else was?" Everly met his gaze. "Because I had no choice but to be ready. Because invisibility leaves you two options: wither away or sharpen in silence. I chose the latter." He wrote her words down, though she doubted he understood them. Afterward, letters arrived, a commendation, unsigned, from the Defense Ministry, an invitation to consult for a technical unit, even whispers of recruitment. Klaus read them aloud with awe, but Everly felt only unease. To accept meant stepping fully into the world she had brushed against on that mountain. To refuse meant returning to the quiet corner where she had hidden before. But she could never really return now. At night, she sat at her desk as she always had. The tools were the same, the diagrams, the rifle parts, the watch gears, the engines, but her hands hesitated now. What once felt like private sanctuary now felt exposed. The world knew what she could do, and with that knowledge came expectation. Some nights, she stared at the mountain through her window, its dark shape a constant reminder. She remembered Thompson's shallow breath, the look in Chun's eyes when the helicopter powered up, the sergeant's disbelief melting into respect. She remembered the silence in the village when she walked back through the square, and she wondered, was this proof of her worth or just another cage? Her chest ached with a contradiction she couldn't untangle. She was proud, yes, but pride felt hollow when it was built on being forced into fire. She hadn't saved those men to prove anyone wrong. She had saved them because she couldn't bear to do nothing. And yet the world insisted on making it about her. One evening, months after the rescue, Chun returned. The pilot found her outside the diner, the evening air carrying the scent of bread. Chun was still sharp-eyed, still steady, but there was a softness in her now that hadn't been there before. "You saved my crew," she said simply. Everly shrugged. "You flew them out. We couldn't have without you." Chun's voice was firm. "You should know. They still talk about you, not just as the woman who fixed a helicopter, as the one who reminded them what courage looks like." Everly looked away, embarrassed. Courage is just doing what needs to be done. Not everyone does it. Chun pressed a card into her hand. "A contact, a door. If she wanted it, if you ever decide you're done pouring coffee, call me." The card felt heavy in Everly's pocket, heavier than any tool, any rifle bolt, any diagram, because it wasn't just opportunity. It was a choice, a future she had never dared imagine. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She thought of the village, of Klaus, of the life she had built in fragments. She thought of her mother's voice, years ago, saying, "You'll never be safe if you stand out, blend in, Everly. Survive by being small." She thought of how small she had made herself, and how impossible it was to stay that way now. But she also thought of dignity, of what it meant to hold onto yourself when the world either dismissed you or demanded too much of you. She closed her eyes, whispering into the dark, "I'm not sure where I belong." The mountain wind answered in silence. Weeks passed, the villagers still stared, still whispered. Chun's card still sat on her desk. Everly carried it like a weight, unsure if it was an anchor or a key. One morning, a tourist sat at her table and asked casually, "Is it true? You're the waitress who saved the soldiers?" Everly froze. Around her, the diner went quiet, all ears waiting for her response. She looked at the tourist, at the villagers who had ignored her for years, at Klaus watching with cautious eyes. She said softly, "No, I'm the woman who did what anyone should have done." The diner held its breath. Then the tourist laughed, dismissive, thinking she was modest. But the villagers knew better. They lowered their eyes, and Everly walked away with the plates, her back straight, her silence louder than any answer she could have given. Because sometimes dignity doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it simply walks away. What happens when the world finally sees you, but you're no longer sure you see yourself? That was the question that lingered in Everly's chest as the summer heat settled over the village. She still wore the apron. She still poured coffee. She still scribbled orders onto slips of paper with her steady hand. But the silence around her had changed again. No longer mocking, no longer reverent. Now it was something else entirely. A silence of unease. The villagers didn't know what to do with her. To treat her like she used to be, clumsy, forgettable, felt impossible after what she had done. To treat her like a hero felt uncomfortably close to guilt, and so they hovered in the middle. Ground, polite but cautious, as though she were a storm that had passed once and might return again without warning. It was the kind of attention she had once craved, and it was unbearable. At night she would climb the narrow staircase to her apartment, set her apron on the chair, and stare at Chun's card on her desk. Weeks had passed. The numbers still waited. She ran her fingers over the printed letters until the ink wore faintly at the edges. A choice, always waiting. Sometimes she wanted to call, to step into a world where her skills were not suspicious curiosities, but valued necessities. To finally belong somewhere her hands would never again be wasted on dropped spoons or forgotten strudel. Other times, she wanted to burn the card, to remind herself that her life did not have to be dictated by the crisis she survived, that she could choose smallness, invisibility, and maybe even peace. But she knew the truth. Peace was gone. Once. You save lives. You cannot unknow the sound of their breathing returning. Once you fix a machine, others call broken, you cannot unknow the hum of it coming alive. Once you climb a mountain, others call impassable. You cannot unknow the view from its summit. And once you are seen, truly seen, you can never go. Back to invisibility. One evening, Klaus closed the diner early. The last light of day streamed across the empty tables. Painting them gold, he sat opposite her, his face tired but kind. "You don't belong here anymore," he said softly. She looked down at her hands, scarred now in small ways from the climb, from the tools, from the blood. "I don't belong anywhere." Klaus shook his head. "No, you don't belong only here. That's different. You've outgrown this place, Everly, and that's not failure. That's what it means to live." Tears stung her eyes. He was right, though she wished he wasn't. Later that night, she climbed the hill behind the village, the same hill where she had once watched soldiers through binoculars, where suspicion had first bloomed around her, the grass bent in the wind, carrying scents of pine and distant rain. From here, she could see both the village lights below and the jagged silhouette of the mountain that had nearly killed her. And it saved her too. She closed her eyes, remembering the voices. "You're just a waitress. You'll bring trouble here. You don't belong." And then other voices. "You saved them. You reminded them what courage looks like. You're not what they said you were." She opened her eyes, tears streaking her cheeks, and whispered to the mountain, "Who am I, then?" The wind gave no answer, but somewhere inside her she knew. She was not defined by the laughter of those who dismissed her, nor by the awe of those who suddenly revered her. She was not defined by suspicion, or even by gratitude. She was defined by what she had done when no one else would move. Her phone was heavy in her pocket. The card even heavier. She pulled it out, held it against the fading light. Chun's name, the number, the promise of a new path. Her thumb hovered over the keypad. She thought of the men whose lives she had touched, of the sergeant whose voice cracked with disbelief, of Klaus finally seeing her, of her mother's warning to stay small, of the girl she had once been, alone in her room with only gears and diagrams for company. She thought of dignity, and with a steady breath, she dialed. The line rang once, twice. Chun, the voice was. Sharp, familiar. Everly swallowed. Her throat tightened, but her words came steady. "It's me, Everly." A pause, then warmth. "I was hoping you'd call for the first time in years." Everly smiled without hesitation. Not because the world had finally seen her. Not because she was stepping into something greater, but because she had chosen it. And choice, she realized, was the truest kind of freedom. Weeks later, when she left the village, no one cheered. No one clapped. The villagers only watched silently as she shouldered her pack and walked away. Some with regret, some with pride, some still with unease. Klaus hugged her once at the station. "Find where you belong," he whispered. She nodded. "I will." The train pulled away, carrying her into a horizon she had once believed wasn't meant for her. The mountains faded behind, the village shrinking into memory. But the lesson stayed. Sometimes strength is quiet. Sometimes resilience is invisible. Sometimes dignity doesn't roar or argue or demand. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.